Hello, welcome to VarnVlog. And I'm going to return to one of my old chestnuts, which is Stafford Beer's fundamental cybernetic principle, POSIWID. Or, as I like to say, the purpose of a system is what it does. Now, I'm going to include some visuals from a PowerPoint today as if I was teaching a class, because I think it's going to help you understand what's going on. So yeah, it's a little academic, but you normally just see my talking head anyway, so let's get right into it. What we're looking at here, and I think it's important to understand this, is to do proper systems analysis, you really do have to not go by just what something is designed to do, but what it actually does and why it's maintained as it does it. And that's a crucial thing in understanding why things go the way they go for all kinds of things. I mean, that's systems, drugs, and I do literally mean like pharmaceuticals, etc. Why do they do what they do? And why do we use them for what we use them for? And we should really think about what they do as what we primarily use them for. Think about, sildenafil or Viagra. That's not a drug that was invented originally for erectile dysfunction, but a side effect of it fixes erectile dysfunction, and that's what we use it for. Well, if you think about this in more complex systems, it's very useful. But let's get into it. So, one of the things we have to deal with here is that in organizational cybernetics, the principle of POSIWID serves as an empirical lens to strip away all the executive rhetoric you might hear from, executives, our favorite people in the world, and evaluate systems without use of this rhetoric or theoretical lens, because a lot of the rhetoric does serve as a theoretical lens by their actual observable feedback inputs. We will explore this theory that structural mechanics, the organizational pathologies it attempts to address, and apply it as a diagnostic to a political economy, including, interestingly today, Karl Marx's value form theory of capital. I bet you didn't know I was going to go Marxist on this, or probably you did, but nonetheless. Stafford Beer formulated this aphorism to bypass what cyberneticians called the teleological hand-waving problem. When a company claims its purpose is customer obsession, but constantly delays shipping to hit internal quarterly cost targets, its true systemic purpose is cost containment. This is done to shift analytic attention from subjective psychological intent or even fake propagandistic intent to objective, more structural behavioral feedback and the feedback loops that come out of it. And cybernetic analysis, at least the traditional ones from the mid and late 20th century, we can treat a system as a black box. Inputs come in, outputs go out, and the relation between them defines the system's actual operational goals, not any teleological thing that we impose in it because of authorial intent. This gets us around manifestos, mission statements, declarations of leaders, charters. Not because those things aren't important, but because if the system doesn't actually use those things to actually do its job, those things are not part of its job. So we have to deal with homeostatic feedback loops. So how does POSIWID, the purpose of a system is what it actually does, actually manifest mechanically? So we can think about this even as a mechanistic way of thinking. And in fact, one of the criticisms of cybernetics theories is that its behavioralism is overly mechanistic. But anyway, it occurs through three primary cybernetic phases. First, there's recursive feedback, meaning that the cause and effect are not linear. Changes loop back to affect the starting point. All right. So this is a feedback loop that is highly recursive, like writing. You write, you revise, you write, you revise, you rethink. It's not a linear progression. Changes loop back to affect the starting point. The system has a set of core variables that it is programmed to protect, such as its funding and its administrative size or its stability. This is a homeostatic clamping. Any reform that threatens these variables is countered by homeostatic defense mechanisms. And remember, homeostasis is so the system stays the same. So that's the second principle. And then our third principle here is that variety attenuation filters out human variety. This is actually a correlate of Ashby's law. I'm going to talk about Ashby's law a little bit, so we'll come back to that. Individuals within a system may have noble goals, but the feedback rules of the network force them to act as if the actuators for pre-existing goals, converting human actors into mere nodes. All right, this is important. So you have a recursive feedback loop. You have attempts to maintain homeostasis for what is actually the values of the system, and you have variety attenuation, which actually both helps and contains human action. So there are four structural pathologies that illustrate how systemic structures bypass human intentions. Pathology, autonomy collapse. Autonomy bay, system 3, system 4 disequilibrium. Pathology, well, I said astronomy, pathology bay. Pathology, see, I'm going to quit doing it in German. Filter failure and Rosy reports, which is, all kinds of bullshit. And pathology D, which is system 5 capture. Now, we actually haven't gone through the 5 layers of cybernetic systems in Beer recently, although I did cover it way back about the first or second year of the show, so you can go back to this. These 4 structural pathologies are direct examples of the purpose of a system is what it does in action. In each case, the design of the organization's communication channels overrules the moral intention of any leaders. For example, in filter failure, managers don't set out to lie. The feedback incentive structures dictates that highlights problems, or highlighting the problems that they see, is punished, while reporting success is rewarded. We've even seen this in science. You talk about the fact that there's an over incentive to publish positive results while not publish negative ones. The system structural channels this to filter out negative feedback, shifting its empirical purpose from the environment mapping to the preservation of a comfortable collective management fiction. And so, for example, when people lie to themselves about the function of a system that they're in, maintaining their belief in that system while not changing it, they are effectively actually doing a filter failure. Now, we do need to understand the various systems. All right, so let's pause and just for me to remind you what the systems of Stafford Beer are. So the 5 systems come from the viable systems model, and this goes all the way back to Stafford Beer's book, The Brain of the Firm, from 1972. These systems are recursive and not truly linear. And that's actually important, but we'll come back to this later. So system 1 is the system that's primary activity itself is a viable system to the recursive nature of the systems. These are concerned with performing a function that is implemented at least in part of the key function of the organization. So system 1 is the value, all right, of what the system is to do. So system 2 represents the information channels and bodies that allow the primary activities in system 1, the overarching goals, basically the teleological orientations, to communicate between each other, and which allows system 3, which we need to talk about in a second, to monitor and coordinate with itself with system 1. This is like the scheduling function of shared resources to be used by the overall vision. System 3 represents the structures and controls that are put into place to establish the rules, resources, rights, and responsibilities of System 1 and provide an interface with Systems 4 and 5. This is the process that then enabled the big picture views from System 1. And System 4 is made up of bodies that are responsible for looking outward to the environment to monitor how the organization needs to adapt to remain viable. System 5 is responsible for the decisions within the organization as a whole that balance the demands from the different parts of the prior systems and steer the organization as a whole, hopefully fulfilling the meaning mission of System 1. So let's go back to our pathologies here. The System 3 control attempts to macromanage the operational details of System 1. This floods the communication channels, violates Ashby's law. Ashby's law is about you need variety to meet variety, and shifts the system's actual purpose from productive output to bureaucratic self-preservation and reporting. This is the homeostasis clampdown. And this also causes the systems to have no autonomy. Eventually, this will probably lead to cascade failure. If you don't know what cascade failure is, this is when you have a highly organized, centralized system having one step in the chain break, causing the entire chain to fall apart. Think a centralized command when you kill the commander, or just-in-time shipping when you run out of materials. Then there's Pathology B. The system hyper focuses on eternal efficiency in System 3 while starving any strategic foresight and anything it can guide it to move the future. The system's actual POSIWID becomes the preservation of obsolete protocols and obsolete systems, driving the systems towards total obsolescence eventually. Pathology C, we've already talked a little bit about, but that is filter feeding. That is when negative information is punished, thus leaving for incentives for people to mislead management in a way that causes System 4 to break. And then there's System 5 capture, where the overarching policy and identity of the system is captured by self-preservation instincts of lower operational systems, meaning anywhere else. Thus, the system's purpose ceases to be its original mandate, becoming a preparation of its own existence and having no teleological function. These are 5 of the basic pathologies that Stafford Beer talked about. We're going to apply this to the MCM cycle, or the MCM prime cycle, depending, which is a capital cycle which functions as an automatic subject prioritizing valorization. Those are big words, but let's talk about it a little bit. Karl Marx's analysis of capital anticipates modern cybernetics in some key ways. If we apply Stafford Beer's insight to Karl Marx's critique of the value form, we can actually see how this works. He describes capital as an automatic subject that pursues self-expansion, which is M to C to M prime, via what is effectively what would be called in cybernetics closed recursive loops. Individual capitalists are not truly autonomous agents. They are personified nodes executing the system's feedback restraints, which is the valorization of surplus value. If you think about the purpose of the system as what it does, this is like a Meta-POSIWID pathology. While capitalist ideology thinks that the market's purpose is to satisfy human needs, which are, in Marx's term, characterized by use values, or by social necessity, depending on what part of Marx you're reading, its POSIWID, its purpose of the system, is what it does, is strictly self-valorization, which is generating surplus value no matter what. When human welfare, use value conflicts with profit, exchange value, or abstract value, if you want to get really into it, the system automatically enforces profit, starving communities to protect value. They can't starve them too much because it would cause collapse. You can also read socially necessary labor time as a homeostatic attractor. Market prices constantly fluctuate. Marx knew that. The labor theory of value is not a theory of price exactly. Socially necessary labor time, though, does actually set the price in some ways. Price deviations send arrow signals that guide capital allocation. right? So if you get too far out off of what it takes to reproduce socially necessary labor time and the abstract time that comes, you're going to lose money, basically. Money in this cybernetic analysis of Marxist understanding is a variety attenuator. Money reduces complex qualitative variety, human needs, cultures, and environments, into a single highly compressed scalar value metric, abstract labor time. Or it turns the real sensuous reality of the physical world into an abstraction, and then turns that abstraction into a commodity which can actually mediate the relationship between things. This attenuates variety by reducing the differences in quality into a quantity. This is why math works in a lot of ways too. It's a variety attenuator. It's also other things, but we're talking about cybernetics here. And then you have reification as a kind of systemic capture. Social relations between human beings are translated into physical relations between objects. Your relationship to money is no longer read as a power relationship between you and someone else. The value form thus hijacks human agency, subordinating it to capital expansion, because you mediate that expansion through the dollar. The dollar hides a relationship of power. And also, it hides the extraction of value. But here you go. Now, this is not a perfect one-to-one. I am actually doing a little bit of forcing here. But I want people to think about how cybernetics and Marxist theories of historical materialism aren't as opposed as they originally seemed, because after all, a lot of early cybernetic theory was based off of Soviet theories by Alexander Bogdanov and research that was abandoned by the Soviet Union and picked up by Norbert Wiener in the 1950s, and then later on by Stafford Beer. And Stafford Beer actually tried to use this and pairing with the Cordalis system in Chile and Allende's Chile to actually build a system that was leaderless. But unfortunately for everybody, they didn't apply it to the military and they didn't arm the workers, so that didn't go so well. So organizational cybernetics and a lot of basic structural Marxism share deep anti-humanist homonology. Now, I am not a strict anti-humanist, actually, but I do think one of the things about this is that you do start to look at people as being constrained, if not determined, but at least very constrained by systems that they exist in that they don't entirely control. Marx's promise of communism is actually to give us control over those systems. That's what it's aiming to do. So as an analytical axiom, and dialectics doesn't usually have analytical axioms, so that's its own thing there. Organizational cybernetics gives us POSIWID. Purpose is empirical system behavior. That's the purpose of a system is what it does. Intention and moral declarations of the leadership are basically noise if they do not align with the empirical system behavior. All right. And Marxism, at least the Marxism of Althusser, I am not a strict Althusserian, I want to make that very clear, but relative autonomy and self-reproduction of relations of production exist, but the system acts imminently reproducing its own structures. And the structures that he lists are like repressive apparatuses, ideological apparatuses, the function of value, etc., etc., etc. What about human subjectivity? In organizational cybernetics, individual actors act as nodes and attenuators executing closed feedback loops bound by channels and requisite variety limits. So you have bound feedback loops. In structural Marxism, you have interpolation. Subjects are constituted through the ideological state apparatus. Human agency is thus structurally limited or structurally produced by these apparatuses. It's a little totalizing, and one of my critiques of a lot of Althusserianism has to do with this. But it is interesting. Systemic goals. Homeostasis is assumed. Boundary maintenance is also assumed so the system can maintain its boundaries, and systemic survival against environmental entropy is assumed as a systemic goal of every system. Whereas structural Marxism sees the self-reproduction of capitalist relations without a terminal disruption or revolutionary rupture are a complete crisis as a systemic goal of capital, hence its evolutions and forms. What about causality? What's the causality model? Recursive closed-loop causality across multiple subsystems ensuring systemic reproduction is the function of causality in cybernetics, at least in this time, and from there backwards, back to Norbert Wiener stuff, this was based off of the Idiomotor effect. Idiomotor effect. Wow, I can't talk today. Whereas in structural Marxism, you have overdetermination, so many things determining a certain outcome that it's impossible to pick this one, and structural are immanent causality. The effect is immanent within the structural relationships because they emerge from the relationships itself. Both of these lead to emergent qualities that can't be factored in teleologically. So that is my desktop background. And this is why I do think it's interesting for people who are interested in Marxism to study cybernetics, because there were convergent frameworks emerging in the 1960s and 70s between French structural Marxism and American cybernetic theory. Now, it's not really one-to-one, and I want to be very clear on that. Nor is, the behaviorist assumptions of early cybernetics generally assumed today. One of the things about cybernetic theory is it moved towards machines because a lot of its understanding of minds was complicated by the cognitive revolution in science and brain science. Now, there's problems with cognitivism, but it does seem to be true that you're not actually dealing with an idiomotor blank slate. So we've had to revise this, and I think a lot of this research has been kind of not picked up for that reason. Anyway, I wanted to more fully explain the purpose of a system as what it does for obvious reasons. I hope you have a good day. And protect your